Hi everyone, I call this lecture Constructing International Politics. It sort of came about really because remember, if you saw the last lecture, I said at the beginning of it, like the students in the online class at the end, well, as I was giving the lecture, I could see like, okay, it feels different and looks different from not my usual lectures. And so I asked them about it at the end and they're like, yeah, this has been the hardest one so far. And so then I designed this one to try and like get to the very nitty gritty, the very, and maybe the most well-known things about constructivism, the most sort of, if this was a store, what I'm about to give you now is like sort of what's in the front window of the store. What I gave you last time is the bulk of the sort of stock, I think, like what's the stock made of in the back room. This is like what's in the window, what's in the shop window as you go by. And so it's, I think it's less deep than the last lecture, but it might be more eye-catching perhaps, like it might help to focus your, if you found the last lecture particularly difficult, it might help you to focus on some of the sort of maybe talking points of constructivism or sort of major contributions to international politics without much of the sort of underlying, not much of the stuff that's under the hood. I've switched from stores now to cars, but hopefully you all know what a store is and then what a car is, and so hopefully that was helpful. All right, so I'm going to share my screen now. Share screen 2. Excellent. All right, and here's the slides. Right, so here we are. So I've taken this from Constructing International Politics, which was published in 1995 by Alexander Wendt. What are structures made of? What this slide is showing, it's showing the major difference between constructivism and neorealists. And you know, Wendt wants to differentiate himself from neorealists, while again, remember, still talking to neorealists, still talking about the same things that neorealists talk about. So he says, look, and you'll remember this from our lectures, and Wendt says, look, you know, for neorealists, the system only varies in the distribution of material capabilities. Right, so it's always anarchic, right? And Wendt wonders why doesn't it ever change? Where's the agency of the agents? Where's the states? What say do they have? They have no say, right? They have no agency to change the system, and Wendt sees that as a problem. You know, so again, go back and for neorealism, for Waltz, the system's always anarchic, the units are always the same, and the only thing that differs is like how powerful each of the different units are. Wendt says no. He says the relationship's not just made up of the distribution of material capabilities, it's also made up of shared understandings, expectations or knowledge which constitutes the actors, which are states, and their relationships. States have certain expectations about how other states will react, and you know, for the realists, you know, remember, it's for the realists, it's like because every other state possesses offensive capability, right? The potential to deploy offensive power against you. Because that's the case, I'm afraid. And so that's sort of an expectation, right? It went saying there's a social thing in there, right? There's like this expectation, there's this understanding, this shared understanding about what it means to possess offensive capabilities. But he says, you know, that's a shared assumption, right? And so as such, it's not the material itself that is causing conflict or causing the state of war of all against all or causing the fear. It's not the material factor that's causing it. It's the shared understandings, right? And so it's a social thing, right? It's an ideas thing. It's not a material thing, right? Maybe I said these all in my explanation for the first one, but material resources like golden tanks they exist, right? And that's an important part of what makes up structures, but it's not, but the, but the actual physical things themselves, the actual material itself doesn't really give us very much. It can't make much of the structure actually. Like this doesn't really mean anything on its own. We have to have the actual, we have to have the meaning of gold. Like gold is a great one. I think it's one of the reasons why he mentions it, although he doesn't go into too much detail about it, but I'll go into too much detail about it. The thing with gold is, of course it's a metal and it has certain properties, right? It has these physical properties, but there's nothing intrinsic in the metal itself that makes it valuable. I mean, okay, like it's non-reactive, right? It's maybe it's a pretty color, but its importance as a means of exchange is a social thing, right? And to some extent that's true of tanks, right? Maybe to a slightly lesser extent, right? Tanks clearly have some sort of physical impact, right, on the environment, can have very large physical impacts on the environment. But we can go quite far with this social idea thing, because we can say, well, yeah, so let's imagine you and I are having a discussion, and I say, oh no, it's all, the tank isn't really about the material, it's about the meaning of the tank, right? It's about the socially constructed meaning of it. And you say, no, don't be silly, right? It's going to put a hole in that building over there. And it's like, yeah, for sure, it's going to put a hole in that building over there. But I don't know if that's probably not the primary purpose of tanks, is it, right? To put holes in buildings, but go with me. So yeah, you're going to say, oh, it's going to put a hole in that building over there. So yeah, it is. But what is that building? Like, what does that mean? Well, that's somebody's house. Yeah, okay, so it means something because that building, that particular, I'm going to say structure, but that's going to complicate what we're talking about. But this building, the fact that it's a home, and the fact that this is blowing big pieces and big chunks out of it, or blowing the whole thing up, right? That's that meaning, that the thing that means to you and me, it's a social thing. It's not as much the material thing. And anyway, a further way to talk about that would be to say, well, you don't have to use a tank for that, right? Some people have tanks. I saw one it was BBC, I think. There was this guy who got this old tank, and in Britain, and he put it in this bit of land. I think he owned this bit of land on the side of a road, and he put this tank there. And the thing is, if you put a tank like that next to a busy road, it becomes a sort of an attraction to local people, or a landmark, and so the local population will come in and maybe play on the tank, or they'll look at the tank. Anyway, it's his tank, it's his land, but he was going to use the land maybe for something else, and so he's moved that tank somewhere else now, and people were up in arms about why he's moved this tank. The point is that was a tank, right? That was materially the same thing in terms of it being a tank. It was materially the same thing as maybe a tank that's moving across the north of France, right, in World War II. But it has a different meaning, right? The question is, do you want a tank to show up outside your front door, right? And generally speaking, if I asked you that question, you'd probably say, well, no, that could be dangerous. I mean, maybe you would think it's cool as well. It would be kind of cool. But if you had the choice and you didn't know anything else other than me saying, do you want a tank outside your house? You'd probably be like, well, it might be exciting, but it might be a bit too exciting, right? So maybe no tank. Yeah, in this case, right, this particular tank in this particular place had a different meaning, right? It had a set meaning, and it was, it was an old tank that people played on, and that people sort of noticed as they drove to work. It'd been there for long enough that it wasn't going to do any damage to anybody, and nobody was worried about it, running them over, or running their car over, or smashing through their house, or blowing stuff up in the neighborhood, because it was just it's like a museum piece sort of thing, right? And that's another thing we could say. So tanks in museums, but yeah, tanks, they acquire a certain meaning, but that meaning might not always be the same, and it might change according to circumstances. There's nothing material about the tank that makes it a thing that we should worry about all the time. And these social structures, right? These sort of the social meaning. It's not just in people. It's not just in our heads, right? It's not just in my head. It's not just in your head. But it's also not just. It's not in the material itself. They are practices like the Cold War. So social structures they're made by practices, right? So the practice of getting tanks into formation, driving across the plains and blasting everything that gets in your way, that's a particular practice, right? And sort of running away from a tank as a civilian, saying, "Oh, this tank's coming, let's get out of here." That's also a social practice, right? We could use tanks in different ways, and we could react to tanks in different ways. Right? There's some agency involved, but you know, the way that we've been sort of trained to react to tanks, and the way that we sort of, you and I agree that, like, if there's a tank coming towards us, you and I probably both think let's run away. Or maybe, like, if it's in a parade, maybe we're like, "Oh, cool, here's a tank," right? So it might vary, but because it can vary from situation to situation, it doesn't always have to elicit the same response. You know, it's nothing, it's not in the material, and it's not just in my head or your head. There's something in there, there's something, some sort of social structure above us, right, that's sort of dictating when and where to be afraid of a tank, and how to be afraid of a tank, and how not to be, how to think a tank is cool in other situations. Anyway, here's the big examples, right? I think the second one I added, I'm obsessed with this second one, by the way, but the first one's actually Wendt's example, so we should spend more time thinking about it. He says this, he says, for the United States, right, what's more threatening? 500 British nuclear missiles or 5 North Korean nuclear missiles? And what Wendt claims this, he says, look, he says, that's an easy question to answer for everyone. Anybody that's interested in international politics will tell you that the United States would be much more worried about 5 North Korean nuclear weapons than it would have 500 British ones, right? Wendt says, neo-realists, as people interested in international politics, they know this, but their theory can't tell them that. We can't derive this from their theory. So they said this is a problem for neo-realism, right? Because they must know that this is true, but their theory says it's false, right? And so then there's something wrong with their theory. We have to figure that out. You know, of course, the idea is, right, that for the United States, North Korea is a problem, right? It's a unit that's a problem, that is a renegade state. It wants to change the way that the world is running. It's removed itself really from the sort of the overall, well, if we were talking about Hedley Bull, it's removed itself from the international society, perhaps from the international system. It tries to isolate itself, and it's doing things that we don't agree with, and we're worried about it becoming more powerful, and it's destabilizing the region. So if they get 5 nuclear weapons, or if they, you know, 5 of their nuclear weapons, that's a big problem for us. Britain, on the other hand, right, they're an ally of the United States. They've been a member of the international system for a long time. They sort of play the game, right? They play by the same rules as the United States, and they, as an ally, they back the United States up in all sorts of scenarios, both in sort of military conflict, in diplomacy, in terrorism, in everything. So we're not so worried. In fact, we're supplying the British with nuclear deterrent, right? The British Trident system is given, you know, is supplied and operate, well, not operate, that's not true, but is we buy it off the Americans, the British buy it off the Americans, right? So there you go. And for neo-realists, though, if it's material, right, if it's offensive capabilities, if it's military capabilities, it shouldn't matter, right? If all states are the same, they all have the same objectives, right, which is to survive, then the UK or the North Korea shouldn't matter. There's 500 nuclear missiles can do way more damage than 5, right? 100 times more damage, right? Roughly. So, so yeah, this is the big problem, and that's a good. If you were only allowed to remember one thing about constructivism, which I advise you not to only remember one thing, but if you were only to remember one thing, this is the thing probably to remember. This is the thing that anybody that takes any class involved in constructivism, this is the thing that they will probably remember. Anyway, I think I probably added this. I'm still fascinated by this scenario, right? We've got NATO tanks in the Baltic states, right? And I'm old enough. I'm not 50, right? But I'm old enough to remember the Cold War, and to remember when the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, were inside of the Soviet Union. They were an integral part, right? As much as, as much as Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia are part of the United States, right? They're incorporated into the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, right, has this history, and Russia generally has this history with Germany, right, where there's these two great powers, Russia and Germany, and they have the space in between them has oftentimes been a battlefield. Napoleon, right, Hitler, probably the most significant occasions, right, but there's always been that threat across those plains. And so, to have German tanks, I put NATO tanks, but German tanks as well, as part of that, to have them inside of what was the Soviet Union 50 years ago, it's got a different meaning now than it would have done in 1985, let's say. In 1985, NATO tanks in Lithuania would have been a completely different scenario than what it is now. Right? So anyway, there you go. And again, the point is with this second one is, materially, the facts haven't changed, right? We can sort of, in terms of geography, right, which is one of the material factors that we talked about in that first lecture, in terms of geography, the geography is the exact same, right? A tank, you can get the same tank. I don't know what sort of advances have been in tank technology, right? But let's even just take, actually, I'm not even sure you have to do it, right? You've got better tanks now. If anything, you've got better tanks that are now than there would have been 50 years ago. So, yeah. So the fact is, the material factors are all exactly the same. The things that are different are the social factors, right? That those states, you and I are agreeing, I assume, that those states are not in the Soviet Union. In fact, you and I agree that the Soviet Union probably doesn't exist anymore, right? And it's this agreement, it's this knowledge, it's this shared knowledge that not just you and me have, right? But presumably also, all the governments of the world, right? Everybody in those governments sort of shares this knowledge, right? That the Soviet Union doesn't exist, and that those three republics are not part of the Soviet Union because it doesn't exist. And we have all this stuff about independent states and sovereignty and all of that it's also social that we understand altogether. And so we say, yeah, if they want to be members of NATO, that's fine. If they want to have German tanks there, that's fine. In a way that we would not have said that in 1985, because the social factors would be different. So finally, then explaining war and peace, right? How does constructivism explain war? Anarchy is not structural cause of anything, says Wendt. He says, what about an anarchy of friends or an anarchy of enemies? Right? Different. Anarchy is not a cause of anything, and that's a direct response to Waltz. Right? No, anarchy is not a structural cause of anything. We'll see in the next lecture, anarchy is what states make of it. Social structure varies across anarchies. The security dilemma can come out of anarchy, where states act to arm themselves, and security community can come out of anarchy when states attempt to reassure one another. So we might be in an anarchy, and you might have some weapons. Let's imagine you and I are states again. You've got some weapons. I might be afraid of that, and I might arm myself. I might see you with a gun, and I say, I better get a gun because that guy's got one, and I don't know what his intentions are. So I go and get a gun. That's one option. Or, and this has happened, right, in real life. I've seen a guy with a gun walking down the street, and I've thought, that's fine. He's not harming anybody. He's not going to harm me. He's just walking down the street. And maybe he would reassure me. I've never really had a conversation like this, but maybe the guy would say, hi there. I'm just walking down here with my gun. I'm having a nice walk. I'm not a threat to you. Right? And I would probably believe him. Although that might be more disconcerting than if you just walk down the street, right? But by his actions, right, he's sort of showing, look, I'm not interested in you, I'm not a threat to you. And so he's reassuring me. And so we shouldn't use that as an example because there's a hierarchy within the United States. But let's go with Russia and Ukraine again, right? It's the easy one. So, Russia has all these troops on the borders of Ukraine, right? But still inside of the Russian state, inside of Russian territory. They've also got some in Belarus as well. And so you've got all these soldiers, right? And, Ukraine is getting afraid to some degree. And last week they were making the Ukrainian government were upset that everybody else, the United States, I think in particular, was making too big of a deal of it and causing fear in Ukraine and destabilization of the economy and that sort of thing, and was playing down, Ukraine was sort of playing down the imminence of the attack, of any attack against them. And I think the US joined in with them as sort of to be supportive, but okay, so they're in an anarchic structure, right? The international system, they're in that. And still, we can see these troops, right? We can see them as a threat, says Wendt, and we can get afraid and we can start sending troops to the region, and we can start sending arms to Ukraine, and the Ukrainians can start training reservists and that sort of thing. And that can exist. But something different can exist, right? Russia can say, which they have, they say, look, we have no intention of invading. And Ukraine could believe that, say, oh yeah, there are not exercises just on the border, right? We don't have to worry about. And then we have a different anarchy, when it says. Anarchy means something different then. Right? But an anarchy of friends, like they just show like there's nothing to prevent the Russians from doing it, but they said they wouldn't, and we believe them. Yeah, the way when I put it like that, it sounds a little bit naive, but why, right? And the answer to that question is our shared knowledge, social structures, that sort of thing. When it says there's nothing in the actual material situation that makes it have to be that way, that this has to lead to violence, or that we have to even be afraid. So neo-realists try to explain war by the anarchic structure, but it's missing the intervening variable of social structure, says Wendt. Right, and then he starts to say like this, well, what about Norway and Sweden? Is that due to the material balance of power? Is that due to the material distribution of power that they're not going to war? No, there's something else. Wendt thinks, right? The United States and Canada, why aren't they at war? Is it because the United States is way stronger? If Canada was just as strong or a little bit more powerful, would it be a different relationship between the two? Neo-realists have to say yes, but constructivists are saying no, something else. Right? There's an anarchy of friends between the United States and Canada that they exist in the international system, and yes, the international system is anarchic. We agree, but those guys are friends, and there's something about the way their relationship is that constitutes them in such a way that to imagine a war with Canada is weird and maybe even funny. Have I said this before? If not, watch, there's a film called Canadian Bacon. It's an older film now, I suppose, maybe the 80s or the 90s it's made, maybe early 90s. So John Candy in it, who I always find it quite funny, but my wife doesn't like it. Anyway, Canadian Bacon, and the whole thing, right, is that, it's sort of this group of Americans who believe that the United States is at war with Canada, and so they go and try and fight the Canadians, right? And the Canadians, of course, right? It's a comedy, obviously, right? The Canadians, of course, because of how nice we all know that they are, right? And this is again shared knowledge, right? Because of how nice we know the Canadians are just trying to help these guys, right? And these guys are trying to like prosecute a war with them, and it's funny, right? And the thought of it's funny. The other thing that's funny, and I don't know if I've mentioned this or not in this class because I've mentioned it so many times, so many classes, but about 10 years ago when I was a graduate student, I came across an article in the BBC again where I was talking about some plans that had been, how they have these military documents or whatever, and then after a certain amount of time they become declassified because it's a long time. And so it was these Canadian military documents from like the early 20th century, like maybe 1910 or something like that, where they had these plans of how they would invade the United States. And it was obviously like a contingency plan. There was no real sort of impetus to invade the United States, but they thought, well, what if something happens that we have to go to war with them? What are we going to do? And so the BBC was discussing these documents that had been released, and basically to come up with these documents, they had to send somebody over the border to a gas station and bought this map of the area, and it was the sort of upper Midwest, right, just west of the Great Lakes, so Minnesota and those states. And I think it was maybe Minnesota. They'd gone over to the gas station, got the map, got back, and sort of drawn on this map and sort of used it to make this plan. And the plan was, I say this partly because I'm sort of proud about how strong Britain was, right? But it's also funny now, right? Because so the plan was that the Canadians would invade on the west of the Great Lakes, and they'd come down those upper Midwest states and they'd hold a position. I can't remember if it said exactly where they would stop, but they would try and make like some sort of a bridgehead there. And they didn't quite put it like this, but it sounded like, you know, they'll invade there, they'll stop, and then they'll wait for the British to come and save them, which, you know, because of what we know now, you and I know about the situation now, I mean, it's funny for all sorts of reasons, right? It's funny because the Canadians can't invade the United States. Like, it would be very detrimental to their national security, and it would be, and also if they did, like, I'm not sure we would recognize that they were invading us, right? We would just laugh. I don't know. It would be like this Canadian bacon thing, where the Canadians don't recognize the Americans are invading. They sort of just laugh and help. And you know, so there's that element of it, right? Like, what are these Canadians doing in, you know, in Minnesota with guns? Like, what's going on? And then, so there's that element. And then there's the element of like, well, why would they ever want to go to war anyway? And then there's an element of like, oh, and now they're going to wait for the British to come and save them. The British are not going to get halfway across the Atlantic at this point. So, yeah. And it wasn't that they were waiting for them to come and save them, but they would sort of have the rear, right? And then Britain, I assume, would come through the East Coast, right? And attempt to join up in some way. But alas, well, not alas, I shouldn't say alas, because because you don't want a war, but between Britain, the United States, and Canada. But you know, that's the thing, is that these culturally and politically, these countries, they have differences, of course, but you know, they tend to be on the same side, at least since the, you know, War of 1812, right? They usually are on the same side. So, yes, and so what explains that, right? Is it a material balance of power, or is it the social structure being different? And Wendt certainly thinks it's not material things. And that's it. Oh, wait, there's one more. Okay, so can we change social structures? Depending on their nature, social structures can be changed. It's not simple. Some people think, oh, social construction, it's silly, right? Because you can just change it by thinking about it, and that's not true, right? Or you could just look at it in a different way. That's not true. The thing with social structures is that they're social, right? So that you and me, like, if I try to convince you like that, no, you're the instructor and I'm the student, right? You probably wouldn't be very happy with that arrangement, right? Because that's not what you came here for, right? And similarly, if you try to do it, I wouldn't be happy with it either, right? So you can't just change the structure by just imagining different things, right? But of course, that you do have to be able to imagine it in a different way to be able to change it. But you know, because it's a social thing, we've sort of all got to agree on it, and that can be difficult, right? If we go back to the Ukraine-Russia example, the problem with that is that, you know, we could just believe the Russians, right? We could, you and me, and so the United States and Germany and Italy and France and Britain. Germany maybe does in some ways, more so than the United States at least believe this already. But we could just sit back and we could say, no, yeah, the Russians are going to do military exercises. They've done military exercises before. They've moved troops around inside their country before. This is just another one of those occasions. We could think like that, right? The thing is, like, if it was just me thinking that, and honestly, I think I am edging towards that, honestly. Well, that doesn't really make any difference to the social structure. Right? It's just one guy over here, and I'm not really in any position of great influence in any of these countries, and so it doesn't make a difference to the social structure. And so it's not that easy, right? But it's also possible, right? And the example that Wendt likes is the Gorbachev example. Remember, he's writing in 1995, which is 5 years after the breakup of the. It's published in 95. It's probably writing before that. So it's right around the time in 1990 when the Soviet Union starts to break up, the Cold War's finished, and so he likes Gorbachev. He's like, look, Gorbachev looked at how the Soviet practices perpetuated the Cold War, and he just reassessed the supposed intentions of the West. He says, no, the West is not trying to destroy us. Now that gets more difficult right now that there's tanks in the Baltic states. It gets more difficult to believe, but Gorbachev believed it, and he could convince enough people because he was in a position of authority he could convince enough people that this was true, right? That the West were not trying to annihilate the Soviets. And in doing so, he ended the Cold War. That's what went things. Because of course, then he starts to behave as though they're not enemies, they're not mortal enemies anymore. Starts to be so defensive and starts talking in warmer and warmer terms with Reagan. Actually, Thatcher had a lot to do with it as well. She doesn't get the credit she deserves on that, but with Thatcher, with Reagan, and all three of them, they start to form a relationship, you know, and they change. And because of that relationship, because of those sort of steps, this reassessment of the intentions of the West that Gorbachev had, like it changed the social structure. It ended the Cold War. I mean, that was major. And it's not that the material capabilities changed. It's not that the balance of power changed. It's that ideas and assessments of intentions changed. Right, I'm finishing that though. I'm finishing that there. That's pretty good, I think.